we have Chinan Dikwa. He is the Vice Chair, African Energy Council, joining us to tell us the findings of his body. Hi, Chinan. Good morning. Welcome to the program.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Chinan.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Chinan. Can you hear me? All right, seems we're having a bit of a challenge with hearing Chinan or Chinan hearing us. Hello, Chinan, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you perfect. Can you hear me at all?
Great, yes. So we're just looking at the numbers, and we saw a steady reduction in the number of crude thefts in Nigeria. And I know that your organization, the African Energy Council, has been following this. Tell us some of the findings, and if you think that this is sustainable, that's a reduction in crude thefts.
Absolutely, and great to see you again. So you're 100% right. At the African Energy Council, we have been doing extensive work to profile the scale of oil theft and just to see the trend like you're putting out there. And I think what you've shown is great, but I've got to say these are very conservative numbers. These are government figures. I think in 2021, some of the unofficial numbers that we had was nearer 200,000 barrels per day, actually, of crude oil that was stolen. Now, if you put that into perspective, if you think about some of the OPEC countries do not even produce up to 200,000 barrels per day. But here we are in a country, Nigeria, and we're losing, that much. So take our sister country like Ghana. Ghana's production at its peak was about 211,000 barrels per day. Today, a lot less, I think 160. But here in Nigeria, these are numbers that we're saying were stolen. So that's just a very clear example. But without a doubt, I think the good news here is since 2021, the trend has been downward, and I'll give you numerous examples. One example is the government came up with what we call Operation Delta Sanity. There was Delta Sanity 1 and Delta Sanity 2. All of this were deployed by the Navy. We recorded decent success in there. But I think by far what we've seen that brought some of the success has been the partnership with the community, where some of those, the ownership, if you like, was passed on to the communities, and that's dropped it quite a lot. Now, in today's world, 2025, the general consensus, when you speak to a lot of the analysts, is that oil theft is less than 5% of production, which I think is very significant and very laudable.
Well, that's interesting, and you talked about the efforts of the government and the cooperation with the community. But sometimes when we talk about stolen crude, so many questions pop up that there are no ghosts. And they actually have to be experts to be able to do this. So I think some of the findings which you shared with me, the areas of this stolen crude, you can see a place like Ebeson oil field in Ondo State. There are 17 Nigerians were arrested and heading towards the Benin Republic. 12 Nigerians and 1 Ghanaian arrested. And then you have the Abo field to Lagos Anchorage. And I'm thinking in my head, it can only be technology if you want to secure these areas, which are so off land, and very intricate when it comes to securing.
Absolutely. So, when we talk about oil theft, many people look at this as a very local problem. The way people imagine it is that, these are people in the creeks, with flanges and, massive spanners, and all they're doing is rupturing pipelines and putting it into small vessels. It's not the case. These are proper industrial operations, and it's something that's transnational. It's not simply about Nigerians. If I give you examples, and you started to mention some of those, let me just profile some of them just to give context here. If I take MV Lima, Panama, that was found off, I think, Brass in Bayelsa State, a large vessel, 15 Filipinos. This was caught at sea. So literally what they did was they took a small container vessel, loaded it up with crude oil, moved it offshore, and they were offloading away into a large VLCC before they were caught. And there's been several examples. We've had Filipinos, we've had Sri Lankans, we've had Russians, we've had Ukrainians and Cameroonians. Several, even Ghanaians, involved in here. The point in here is this. It is a massive international operation. It's a very touchy subject. I understand that. Many people don't want to talk about this. It's a very touchy subject because it has a lot of nationalities. And that's why,
Chinan, sorry to interrupt you, a lot of people say, yes, you have Filipinos and Cameroonians, Africans and Ukrainians and all of that, but none of this would be possible if there was no cooperation from the inside.
That's exactly the point. So what we have done, I'm going to say this to you, you're 100% right. What we've done is we've just reported on the very obvious ones, the nationalities. Behind those nationalities is a huge network of Nigerians who are working in tandem. And part of the work that we're doing, without spilling the beans, is trying to go one level down into that, to try to understand what networks are in there and where the relationships go to. Now, you see, the reality of it is it's a huge operation, right? And it's something that has to be done with a lot of care, and we're being very sensitive around putting things, putting things too early. But that work is ongoing right now. But let me say this, I'll say this. You see, when it comes to oil theft, people have to understand. The first step, yes, is coming in and rupturing a pipeline and then connecting that pipeline to a small barge, usually about 15, sort of 15 metric tons, something like that, a small barge. Once the crude oil goes into that barge, the next step then is to take that crude oil and take it offshore further down. Now, most of the times, I can tell you this, what we're finding, they take the barge and move it around. There's a triangle around Lome, Togo, and Benin Republic. There's a small triangle around there where a lot of the transfer, the ship to ship transfer takes place. So small vessel comes, a big vessel is waiting, usually a VLCC, massive container vessel. What happens then is they transfer the crude into that. The moment you transfer it in there, they sail further offshore. As they go offshore, that is where the magic then happens. That crude has come in, new papers, forged papers will come up, they'll forge the papers, they'll take that, pass it away further into, offshore, and then blend it with another crude so that the origin of it is not quite clear before it goes into international markets. In fact, I'll tell you this, stolen Nigerian crude has been found in Singapore. Stolen Nigerian crude has been found in the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Stolen Nigerian crude in the US, in Venezuela. I mean, several countries have had stolen Nigerian crude. And you're 100% right. We are profiling those nationalities, but the next step is we're going further down and looking at the connections within Nigeria. And that will be the next phase of our work.
All right. So we have the good news that crude theft is reducing. I think you said about 5% of our production now. Do we see a commensurate increase in our revenue? When you compare the days of high crude theft and now a reduced crude theft?
So that's a great question, Amy, but I'll answer it this way. Yes, there is an increase in our crude production. It would be very difficult for me to tell you that simply because of crude oil, because we're plugging those gaps from crude oil theft, but I'll tell you this without a doubt. One is that we're seeing, huge amounts of production that are coming in. A lot of it driven by the reforms that we're seeing in the oil and gas space. So lots of, an example is the cost efficiency executive order and other, sort of incentives that we're seeing. That has certainly led to us increasing production a lot more, certainly above 1.5 million barrels for crude. Okay, 1.5 million barrels of crude, the numbers just came out from OPEC. But also, there's no doubt that we're plugging the losses from crude oil theft. We have. There's no question about that. We have seen situations where in the Niger Delta, particularly in communities around Bielsa, who literally work in partnership with government to police those pipelines and make sure that any vessel that comes in, is reported to Navy. But beyond that, they're working in tandem. And that has certainly led to us seeing crude oil production for Nigeria, and of course, translating to revenue.
All right, Chinan, thank you so much. At least we have some good news there. We had a GDP yesterday with some good numbers. So perhaps we're on the right path with President Bola Tinubu's administration. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your findings with us this morning. Chinan Dikwa, Vice Chair of African Energy Council.
Pleasure. Thank you.